I'll let you share.
So how about if I
Yeah,
go
that's perfect.
there?
I just turned the front, no dramas.
Can you hear anything? Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I really hate to break into such a wonderful discussion that's going on in the room, but we'll have opportunities to discuss further in a little while. I'm Professor Robert Saint. I'm Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at Flinders University, and I'll be your host for this evening. I'd first like to acknowledge that we meet on the traditional country of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging. I recognise and respect their cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land and understand and acknowledge that that's a relationship that continues to be important to the Kaurna people living today. Before we commence the evening, please note that the emergency exits are located outside of these doors through the glass sliding door and turn right towards the stairwell. The meeting point is out in Victoria Square. Facilities can be accessed outside of these doors, again through the glass sliding door and turn left down the hallway. So welcome. And thank you for joining Flinders for this research lecture series entitled Brave. If you wish to share this event with your peers, please make sure you tag Brave Research. I assume that's one word, but I assume it is, into your posts or tweets. Brave is not just a reflection of the extraordinary research that Flinders University pursues today, it's a call to action that harks back to the earliest days of our institution. As we at Flinders make inroads into our mission to change lives and change the world, we are focused on making a difference by extending the boundaries of knowledge, by addressing the big challenges, and by changing lives for the better through our research. Our founding Vice-Chancellor, Professor Peter Carmel, explained his ambitions for Flinders in the now famous quote, "We want to experiment and experiment bravely." And that's where our name for this series has come from. It's a concept that has captured the imagination of successive generations of Flinders researchers and continues to inspire us today. The bravery is evident in the way our researchers go about their work and the new research discoveries that we're sharing with the world for the greater good. Tonight we're aiming to provide insight into understanding the work involved in responding to the grim world, I have to say, of domestic and family violence. And what better researcher to enlighten us than Professor Sarah Wendt? Sarah has taught social work for over a decade. Prior to academia, she practiced in the field of domestic violence. She's published on violence against women and social work practice. Her current research projects explore the impact of domestic violence on women's citizenship, service provision for Aboriginal communities experience family and violence, and engaging men to address domestic violence. In particular, Sarah has been researching rural women's experiences of domestic violence for over a decade in Australia, and more recently how domestic violence work shapes practitioners living and working in rural communities. It's now my great pleasure to invite Professor Sarah Wendt to speak to you.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for your attendance this evening. It's lovely to be spending some time with you. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional owners of the land we meet on today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and I also want to acknowledge and pay respects to the cultural wisdom and knowledge in this room tonight. I also want to acknowledge the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. The 16 days of activism against gender violence began on the 25th of November. The theme this year for 2018 is #HearMeToo. It brings to the forefront the voices of women and girls who have survived violence, who are defending women's rights every day and who are taking action. Many of them very far away from the limelight or the media or the headlines. These are the faces that we may not have seen in the newspapers and the stories or on social media. So tonight, I therefore bring women's voices into my presentation, but also the voices of the practitioners who work on the front line, and they are rarely in the limelight. So I want to acknowledge also, before I begin, the agencies who have actually particularly supported me in my research, because I couldn't do it without their support, particularly Women's Safety Services South Australia, KWY, the Department of Child Protection, Uniting Communities and Centrecare, who have enabled me to do my research. I would also like to acknowledge that some of the material that I'm going to share with you tonight comes from the funding from ANROS, the Australian National Research Organisation for Women's Safety. So I kind of feel honoured that I can come to you today and share some of my insights from my work across decades on domestic and family violence. But I also want to acknowledge that I actually don't do this work in isolation. I work closely with agencies, the ones that I've already mentioned. I listen to women. I've been getting to listen to men as part of my research methodologies. But I also have a chance to talk to wonderful colleagues who are also thinking about and tackling this issue of domestic and family violence with me. Particularly influential people have been Suzanne Fransway, Nicole Moulding and Fiona Buchanan from UniSA, Chris Natalia, Kate Seymour, Lorna Hallahan, Carmela Bastian and Michelle Jones from Flinders University. I would also like to acknowledge leaders in this field that are here with us tonight, Dan Moss and Chris Dolman, Ali Elder, Jenny Cisneros and Fiona Ward, who are here tonight. Thank you. I would also like to acknowledge the Aboriginal leaders and practitioners in the space who have spent a lot of time with me throughout my career for your insight, your patience and your determination, particularly Tracy Rigney, Craig Rigney, Annette Grote, Rachel Abdullah and Dana Shen in the most recent times. Thank you, Flinders, for the opportunity, and thank you, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research Rob Saint, for your support. So, beyond the bruise, the invisible elements of domestic and family violence. Tonight, I want to expose what is behind what we think we know about domestic and family violence. I want to move the conversation beyond the statistics, move the thinking about domestic violence as an incident of only physical abuse, that domestic and family violence is only thought of or responded in crisis terms, you know, something to be risk managed. Though these things are really highly important because they actually stop death and they stop serious injury, we can't stay in this view of domestic and family violence if we're ever going to tackle this problem. So my key messages tonight are, if we're going to tackle this issue, we need to do a couple of things. We need to acknowledge that domestic and family violence exacerbates gender inequality, and gender inequality contributes to domestic and family violence. We need to acknowledge that domestic and family violence has significant long-term consequences for women and children. We need to acknowledge that domestic and family violence is a complex problem that requires long-term responses beyond a crisis response. And lastly, we need to acknowledge the invisible workforce expected to respond to this immense social problem. And it's these 4 points that I'm going to work through tonight and talk about with you. So to start, before I start getting into those 4 points, we actually kind of need to be clear about what we're talking about tonight, and that's domestic and family violence. So in Australia, the current leading domestic violence policy document is the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children. The Australian policy definition focuses on descriptions of behaviour that constitute domestic violence and the intent of those perpetrating it. So let me just read to you the national statement and the plan and the definition for domestic violence. It refers to acts of violence that occur between people who have or have had an intimate relationship. While there's no single definition, the central element of domestic violence is an ongoing pattern of behaviour aimed at controlling a partner through fear. For example, by using behaviour which is violent and threatening. In most cases, the violent behaviour is part of a range of tactics to exercise power and control over women and their children, and it can be criminal and non-criminal. Domestic violence includes physical, sexual, emotional, social, financial and spiritual abuse. To understand the enormity of this issue, you have to get your head around the concept of coercive control. Central to domestic violence is an ongoing pattern of behaviour, most often used by men, aimed at controlling women through power and fear. The 4 major tactics of coercive control is violence, intimidation, isolation and control. I also will be using the term family violence tonight to acknowledge that for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people they use family violence to describe a wide range of relationships where violence might take place and to actually highlight the effects of abuse on the whole family. Also, the term family violence is preferred because it's used to recognise the historical context of colonisation, oppression and dispossession, and how this context affects individuals, families and entire communities. So, I just want to, before we get into some of the messages, also, I just want to lay down some facts. So let's be clear, when we're talking about domestic violence, there's some facts that we can't ignore. And we can't ignore these because they're being repeated over and over again. So let me quickly go through them with you. Approximately a quarter of women in Australia have experienced at least one incidence of violence by an intimate partner. Most victims and survivors of domestic and family violence are women. On average, 1 woman a week is killed by her intimate partner. Women are much more likely to experience violence by someone they know than by a stranger. Women are often experience multiple incidences of violence across their lifetime. Violence against women and their children results in major personal, government and business costs. And so if you're interested, the estimate for 2015 to 16 is up around 22 billion. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women experience high rates of violence with significant health impacts. Children often see and hear violence between their parents, and domestic and family violence is a factor in many child protection cases. We also know that many women actually do not seek help for domestic and family violence. But what we have to acknowledge, even though we have all these facts, they are actually highly likely to be underestimated. For particular groups of women, so Aboriginal women, women from different cultural backgrounds, women with disabilities, and I could go on, the diversity of women's lives are ignored in these statistics. They're just not captured. We can also have long debates about these statistics, debates about how they're collected, what counts, and these debates can go on and on forever. But in short, I'm a bit tired of those statistic debates. We're never going to know the real extent of the problem. But what we do know is that all violence is wrong, regardless of the sex of the victim or the perpetrator. But what we also know is that there are distinct gendered patterns in the perpetration and impact of domestic and family violence, and we need to really come to terms with that. Recognising the gendered patterns of violence doesn't negate the experiences of male victims, but it does point to the need for an approach that looks honestly at what the research is telling us and addressing the gendered dynamics of violence. That's what's needed. So I'm going to move on from statistics. I want to say that statistics are important. They show you a big picture of a particular social problem, and these statistics show you a very devastating picture. But what statistics unintentionally do is they actually ignore the reality and the diversity of women's and children's experiences of violence. They cannot capture the complexity that's embedded in this social issue. Women and children survive domestic and family violence by calculating, evaluating, placating their perpetrator for very long periods of time, as well as reassessing their own behaviour, including resistance or self-defence, or they actually experience really long periods of self-blame. Statistics don't tell us these survival stories. Statistics won't tell us the endurance of this problem. Statistics don't tell us how much we know about who the perpetrator is. The statistics won't tell us about the complexity of his life, how he came to use violence in his intimate relationships. I want to have a conversation to recognise the invisible elements of domestic and family violence. I want us to think about this problem as really complex. So in understanding complexity from my own research, I want to share with you some things tonight. I want to give you a glimpse of the unique experiences of different groups of women. I want to show you the long-term consequences of domestic and family violence for women and children, which are often hidden from view. How domestic violence can intersect with other social concerns like child protection. I also want to share with you, in understanding complexity, how we engage with men who use violence. Who is the perpetrator, the intricacies of his life, how he's been recruited to particular gender patriarchal ideas and discourses to use violence against women and children. This always has to be a parallel conversation. So if domestic violence isn't complex enough, complexity will again rear its head when you start looking at the service system in place to address it. Who responds to all this and how are they responding to it? So let's start the journey with the unique experiences of different groups of women. In my book, Domestic Violence in Diverse Contexts with Lana Zanantino, we argue that the role and operation of gender in the lives of diverse communities of women cannot be ignored, because gender shows local understandings and nuances of relationships between men and women, but also amongst women and amongst men themselves. Therefore, how domestic violence is understood and responded to in families and communities. So through the stories about the experiences of domestic violence, we were able to draw out the gendered discourses and the particular subject positions that women engage with in their everyday lives, and how this shapes their experiences of domestic violence and how they then respond to it. Let me give you some examples. So we found, for example, mothers. Mothers are well aware of the standards, the high standards of nurturing, protecting, keeping the family intact so that children can have a father. They're therefore required to be caring, selfish, committed to the relationship. We found older women were often more familiar with traditional femininity ideas like submissive, passive, subservient, and they could talk about how that shaped their lives and decisions over time. Let me share with you an older woman named Cheryl when she says this: "I wasn't educated and I wasn't aware of my rights because he hadn't really hit me. I wasn't aware that, it was abuse when he kicks the back door down. He would watch me when I'd leave the house. He would always know where I was, but I kind of didn't consider that abuse. He told me he was allowed because he owned the house." We also spoke to religious women. Religious women talked about masculine authority and feminine submission as being constructed as divinely ordered and ordained. So a woman said to me, "There's a spiritual element to all this. They confirm it with scripture. That's why I've never reported it to the police." Refugee women experience tensions of being protectors of family and culture. They share trauma, loss and vulnerability with their partners, yet they endure violence by their partners. Rural women talked about being constructed as loyal, dutiful, protective of marriage and farming life, because you need that for inheritance. Aboriginal women experience gender in contexts of colonisation, dispossession and fragmentation of their cultures, but talked about how women are really important maintainers and carriers of Aboriginal connections, identity and belonging for their children. And so Aboriginal women often put their own safety at risk to balance obligations to their culture and their communities. Gendered discourses position lesbians as inherently non-violent, emotional and bitchy, making domestic violence seem, really unlikely or less serious. And I quote a woman, "I asked my sister, why didn't you help? Why didn't you help? And she told me, we all thought you were overreacting." We found women with intellectual disabilities that they are often positioned as promiscuous, or they're positioned as asexual, or they don't know any better. So they're not real women, so they wouldn't experience domestic violence. We also found that despite the diversity of experiences and constructions of gender, we found the most gendered discourses still construct femininity within the context of home, family and community life. Consequently, women's roles within these realms are far more highly scrutinised than men's, leaving the door open for women to face blame and responsibility when these domains become fractured or broken. It's women's behaviour rather than men's that become the focus, and women often end up blaming themselves for the violence, for staying, for leaving. They never win. In advancing domestic violence understandings and getting an appreciation of the complexity of these issues, I do want to acknowledge that it's mainly women who have had to endure the scrutiny and the judgment by society while we try and come to terms and grips with this social issue. What our book shows is that there is a rich tapestry of complex gender constructions that underpin and inform domestic violence. Gender constructions impact on women's own, their partners, families and communities' understanding and responses to domestic violence. Gender ideas and constructions are formed over lifetimes. They're formed over cultures. They have really deep histories. We need to acknowledge this in how we're going to think about long-term solutions, which I want to come back to. But I want to finish my point about complexity of gender by sharing the words of a woman I interviewed. Domestic and family violence are informed and justified by many complex gender ideas, and this one's a nice summary. I think the belief of forgiveness certainly impacted on me, and I felt that pressure on me to forgive him rather than pursue a legal line. It was also about reconcile, to stay in the marriage. You have to stay for your children. I guess also the consequences that I actually believed in all this too. So the invisible elements of domestic and family violence is the complexities and the nuances of gender that's lived in the everyday lives of women, men, children and their families. Often when we think about domestic violence, what we go to and what we often think about is women leaving. She'll just be okay if she leaves. So in opening up another conversation about the invisible elements of domestic and family violence, I now want to share with you some of the long-term consequences of this issue. With colleagues, we collected data from Australian women via a large online survey conducted in 2016, where we had 57 questions about women's backgrounds, but particularly questions around mental health, employment, housing and social activities. And in total, we had 658 women participate in this study, with about 60% being aged below 45 years. The majority of these women, close to 80%, had children with them, and approximately 1/3 of the participants now have an annual income of below $30,000. I want to highlight for you some of the key findings from this study to make my point about the long-term impacts of domestic and family violence. The majority of women, 63%, continued to experience violence from their former partner following separation. Women's home ownership did not return to the previous levels of joint ownership, and private rental increased. 42% of women had to make a significant geographical move as a result of his violence. 21% of women regained some stability and security through home ownership, but then had to bear the increased cost, often debt because of the previous damage to their property from him, or increased security costs. So you want to get your screens on, your videos, your guard dog, etc. The majority of women, 75%, did not continue in the same workplace following separation. On leaving domestic violence, 1/3 of women depended on family and friends for immediate accommodation. Only an extremely small percentage said they contacted a women's shelter. Almost half of the women received a diagnosis of a mental illness either during or after domestic violence, and all forms of social activity by women decreased significantly during domestic violence. That is, friendships, their volunteering, their social support groups, their political groups, their sport and their church all plummeted. Domestic violence affected all the women in each of their 4 areas of work, housing, mental health and social activity. So this is what we've found, that domestic violence has social, material and economic costs to women and children and therefore the wider community. It actually erodes key domains of life over time, and those were the domains that we particularly looked at. I also want to quote for you a woman that reveals how this is actually felt, how these long-term consequences are lived in reality. The injuries I sustained, physically and emotionally, have affected my ability to work and provide for my family and myself. Therefore, my child doesn't get to go away for holidays. The car constantly needs repairs. The bills continue to pile up, and the list goes on. I recall my last job interview a couple of years ago for a sales management role when my medical condition had deteriorated, but I was desperate for an income. The general manager asked me about my child, in a kind way, and I burst into tears. I lost my confidence, I lost my business head, and the woman I thought I was. I was suffering major depression, yet refused to believe it, all I had circling around in my head were the bills that needed to be paid. Domestic violence goes much further than the time a woman leaves. It affects our lives, it changes our lives. It's destructive and it's continuing far beyond a reach of what society may ever think. We argue that domestic violence can be understood, therefore, as an assault on citizenship, driving at the very heart of women's full participation in society, and it actually exacerbates gender inequality, which makes violence against women possible in the first place. So in making my point about complexity, the invisible elements of domestic and family violence is the long-term devastating impacts on the lives of women and their children. So let's go to another invisible element of this social problem, and that is children. Children are also exposed to violence. In the 2016 Personal Safety Survey undertaken by the ABS, they asked adults if any children in their care had seen or heard violence. 1 in 2 women who'd experienced violence from a current partner reported yes, and more than 2 in 3 women who experienced violence from a previous partner also reported yes. Witnessing meant seeing the actual incidences of violence, children intervening to try and stop it, and it also meant hearing violence from another room, and it also meant children observing the aftermath of physical violence. There is a large body of evidence to suggest that children who live in families where there's domestic and family violence are also more likely to experience other forms of child abuse, including neglect and physical and sexual assault. Perpetrators may involve children in violence as part of exercising their power and control. And then you think about the stress of living with domestic and family violence and how that might impact on your parenting capacity to provide a safe and nurturing environment for children. And often this unfortunately results in neglect. To make this point, I just want to read a quote from a woman I interviewed about mothering in the context of domestic and family violence, and you'll get some insight into how this issue starts to intersect with child protection and how it impacts on parenting. But you'll also get some insight into how gender plays out over time and how victim and perpetrator roles can become constructed in different contexts of child protection concerns. This quote also shows insight into the potentially long-term impacts on women and their children. I used to constantly beg the children, just do as they're told and stay in their rooms. When I knew he was sort of all worked up, because, he'd be ringing me constantly during the day, for example, I knew everything needed to be in its right place when he got home or it was going to go crazy. I had to beg the kids, tidy things up, put things back, be hidden in their bedrooms and not dare get out of their rooms when he came home. I suppose I used to suffer anxiety, and so I used to get pretty worked up. But unfortunately, you do start taking it out on the kids. I used to yell and scream at them, get in your rooms, because I knew what was about to happen the minute he pulled in the driveway. I was on edge constantly. I also want to say that recently I've had the privilege of working and talking with child protection practitioners and about their challenges of domestic and family violence and recognising it in the context of their work. It's clear from these conversations that domestic and family violence cannot be constructed as just individual incidences. The sector is asking for a shared understanding of this problem that actually recognises patterns of behaviour across time, gendered coercive control and power, and the actual impacts of trauma on women and children, and how trauma starts to shape how men use violence in their relationships. And I just want to finish this section with a quote from an Aboriginal practitioner who makes this point well. We need to recognise the history and pattern of violence, share that between agencies, for workers' safety and for effective intervention. It's not being reactive to an incident. You've got to step back and you need to look at the bigger picture. And I think the nature of child protection and family violence, where they intersect, at the moment is so reactive, it's just Band-Aid over and over again. So again, the invisible elements of domestic and family violence is the impact on children, how it shapes parenting and how it can affect the next generation. So in painting this picture of complexity with you, what we've done is we've examined how gender constructs and shapes women's lives in diverse ways. We've also painted a picture about the long-term consequences of this problem. At the same time, and I've increasingly started to hear, and I welcome this, there are calls for men to take responsibility for violence. We are demanding that authorities hold perpetrators accountable. We're probably familiar with men's behaviour change programs, as they have been the focus of intervention. These are questions asked over and over again across the sector. Can men change their violent behaviour? Can men really shift their minds and attitudes towards women in broader society? When is a man ready to take responsibility for violence and abuse? How do you measure success in programs? And success for who? For him? For her? For the children? When you start asking these questions, you start to realise that perhaps we're asking too much of a 12-week program. The invisible element of domestic violence is also engaging and working with men who use violence. I conducted a study across regional South Australia and had the privilege of talking to practitioners across the sector. And do you know what they all raised of significant concern with me? Is the limited means of specialist services for men who use violence in their intimate relationships, perceiving support for behaviour change to actually be really largely absent in their communities. Many practitioners felt strongly that the services for men to be provided by highly trained specialist practitioners, otherwise the complexities of gender and power and control, all those dynamics will get lost. Practitioners express frustration at the often short-term, one-off attempts to provide services or programs for men. And I just want to read this quote for you from a practitioner. When we get anything that looks like it's about addressing perpetrators, that anger management stuff or anything like that, it's typically underskilled and not specialist, and it's cowboy operated pretty much. That's what we get, and it feels a bit like we're getting the dregs sometimes. Just do something. Give them a service, give them 50 grand and they'll fix it up. And it does more harm than good. I would rather have nothing than do it half-assed. It's insulting and it's disrespectful. And the people who suffer are the women and the children who are experiencing violence and abuse. And then the men wear it like a badge. I've done it now, I'm better. More recently, I've had the privilege of working with a group of counsellors who are informed by invitational and narrative ideas to engage men who use violence. We were actually able to interview the counsellor, the man, and his partner if she wanted to. We're still actually analysing and writing up this study, but I just want to provide you with a snippet. I want to give you an insight into the complexities of behaviour and attitudinal change, as well as the long-term nature of this highly specialised work. For those that don't know, really quickly, invitational narrative practice, the process of engagement is designed to locate responsibility for the man's realisation achievements within himself so that he can own this readiness and increase capacity for change. The practitioners work to reach ethical strivings, and it's thought possible that men can recognise and resist patterns of behaviour, abusive behaviour, by recognising, restraining, or what they call dangerous ideas that inform their behaviour. So realisations and change and expressions of accountability are seen by how men name abusive practices, how they understand the effects of their abuse, and how they face that shame. And furthermore, it can also be seen in how men engage in understanding the political nature of this problem. So let me give you an example so you can see this complexity. So Steve, I'll just call him Steve, he has been working with a counsellor and attending men's groups for 2 years. And when we interviewed him, he actually could articulate the harm and the effects from his use of violence, and I want to quote him. "Jane silenced herself so much from what I gather, and even now she still says, 'I'm not going to say anything because it's just not worth it.' So despite what's going on now, that domestic violence imprint, it's still there. It may never get to that point where she feels she could just say what she wants to say. She might think something's going to go wrong. She might even say, she even says now, like there's situations that crop up and she'll just start crying and then she'll get flashbacks. It's almost kind of like PTSD. She's been traumatised by it. I want to say that the counsellor also confirmed these accounts, that Steve could recognise this effect on his partner. And I also want to acknowledge that Jane, his partner, she also observed this change over time. So she used words like, "I feel safer, I'm not as scared anymore." But this is 2 years of intense work, okay, with one man. But the counsellor, Steve and Jane, were still reluctant to make definitive claims about that change. So what we're finding is that from the stories, it's not possible to determine change in absolute or concrete conclusions. Instead, it's possible to describe maybe key moments of change and the tensions experienced in the change journey. So change is complex. Men's behaviour and attitudinal change is long-term work. This is another invisible element of domestic and family violence. So I hope you're starting to get the picture that domestic violence is complex and that I've started to paint this for you. I now want to use this picture to actually turn to the response. How are we responding to this issue? From a study I conducted across regional South Australia, we found that the women's descriptions of social isolation was staggering and devastating. Women had limited social networks and supports. They had limited social resources as a consequence of domestic violence. The social abuse that they endured from their partner eroded much of their life. But most of the women that we spoke to in this study emphasised the importance of counselling and finding the right person to talk about the violence and the abuse. They wanted to move beyond the crisis and the short-term response that's often given. This response is given because of limited resources to the specialist agencies in the community. Practitioners also recognise and argue that long-term support and counselling to understand power and control and the trauma associated with domestic violence is vital if women and children are going to recover. I wanted to share with you, from an interview, Sandy. Sandy described isolation, and she reflected that perhaps this contributed to her decision to visit her ex-partner after she had left him. She described how her ex-partner reached out to her, which resulted in her being in danger, quite significant danger again. Sandy explained that the domestic violence service was incredibly valuable and not judging and helping her explain and understand coercive tactics used by partners even post-separation. Her account illustrates the importance of post-crisis specialist support given by a domestic and family violence service in helping women understand the features and behaviours of male perpetrators. But with the focus on high risk, crisis management, many practitioners express frustration and guilt about not being able to provide long-term counselling. But they argue that long-term counselling is vital. It's in order to ensure that women understand the risks associated with this violence and that the specialist understandings of domestic and family violence that informs crisis work isn't currently being translated into long-term support. That's what worries the sector. So the long-term support to assist women to recover has implications for women's long-term outcomes in two main ways. First, the practitioners argued that without independent long-term support, they believe it becomes harder for women to resist pressure from the perpetrator or the friends or the family to reunite with him, particularly when there's legal stuff at play. And without long-term support for women, perpetrators are more likely to manoeuvre their way back into the home and ignore orders, and women are more likely to withdraw the charges. Second, practitioners argue that long-term support is vital because it erodes women's social networks. It impacts negatively on women's mental health. And so as a result, women often leave violent relationships without social support. They don't have close friends for quite some time, and they have no or strained, often, relationships with family. So domestic violence creates social isolation, and this can have really significant impacts for recovery. So it's the long-term recovery that becomes the focus. So I just want to share with you, this is a quote from a woman to demonstrate what I'm talking about, the effects of social abuse. So she says, it's his strategy. While it's been controlling, it's also been isolating. He didn't approve no matter who I became friends with. If I had an acquaintance that I liked that person and we went down the path of developing that acquaintance, he stopped it. He didn't like it, and he made that obvious. Isolation as an emotional, mental thing is totally different. It hurts, it's devastating, and it goes to your centre. I always feel lonely. And I just want to finish a quote from a practitioner. I've noticed that women come here looking for counselling because they're still traumatised, but we've got to deal with the crisis that always are coming up. So they're not really getting what they need, that long term. Trauma work is under-recognised and resourced. It's unrecognised by government because they want a quick fix, and there is no room for more complex, sophisticated understandings of the long-term dynamics and the effects of domestic violence. I do now just want to pause just for a second and note that yes, it was my intention today to come and have a conversation with you to expose the complexity of this issue, to name the hidden elements of domestic and family violence, and use this exposure to start having a conversation about long-term engagement and therapeutic responses for women and children and men. But I also want to acknowledge that in particular, Aboriginal people have been saying this for a very long time. Understanding intergenerational trauma is vital for Aboriginal people, and it's long-term support that they have been advocating for. And as they say over and over again, this is the only way to unpack trauma and enable healing in their communities. We can learn a lot by listening to this, but when I say that, I also can't help but feel or notice how tired Aboriginal people must be saying this over and over again. Let me give you an example. Back in 2014, I spent some time with Aboriginal workers and leaders in the northern suburbs of Adelaide. I was commissioned to do a piece of work around responding to family violence in this region. We talked about tensions around understanding domestic and family violence. We talked about the tensions of colonisation and dispossession, gender relations and lateral violence in Aboriginal contexts. We also talked about what was needed to respond to family violence and this associated complexity. And do you know what? The term cultural safety was emphasised. But cultural safety was not simply a non-Aboriginal service putting on cultural awareness training or employing an Aboriginal person and then feeling good about themselves. Cultural safety was explained to me as creating, maintaining a place that Aboriginal people feel safe, comfortable and welcome in. And this is more likely to be created by Aboriginal specific services, which are run by trained Aboriginal people and is family and community focused. Cultural safety is belonging, and it is felt. When it's felt, you can tackle family violence much more successfully and confidently, is what I've been told. In my recent time in the Department of Child Protection, do you know what? This message was told to me again. Aboriginal specialists emphasise the importance of understanding intergenerational trauma to understand the intersection of child protection and domestic violence. They advocate for Aboriginal workers working alongside Aboriginal families. However, this is challenging work because long-term support's needed to unpack the trauma. Yet again, our emphasis is always at the crisis end. I just want to quote and finish with an Aboriginal practitioner saying, "We need to employ Aboriginal workers to work alongside Aboriginal families for years and years. Aboriginal consultation needs time. Our people with our families, doing our work, you know, but I just think for continuity of service, surely that's got to get a better outcome, you know?" So in summary, domestic and family violence does not have a quick fix answer. Gender needs to be understood in all its diversity, the long-term consequences need to be acknowledged, and long-term responses are needed to understand and recover from the associated trauma. So in summary, if we want to be brave and have a conversation about the invisible elements of domestic and family violence, we need to acknowledge the devastating impact on women and their children, and this is long-term. The time and skill to engage and work with men to understand their behaviour and attitudes, accept responsibility and change their behaviour and attitudes is going to take a long time. And the diversity of families' experiences, the time and skill needed to respond to women and children's trauma is also needed. At the moment, crisis response dominates this space because domestic violence is highly dangerous. And the statistics actually show us that. But if we're going to recognise the complexities of domestic violence and the invisible elements, we need a workforce that supports the intervention continuum right through to the long term, not as a drop-off, not as a forget. So, before I finish in giving some thoughts about the workforce, you might be asking yourselves, why haven't we got there yet? Why are we still struggling with this conversation? Why are we still in this complexity, even though we know so much research about it already? I'm going to share with you two insights, one for the theorists in the room and one for the practitioners. For the theorists in the room, let me introduce you to the concept of sexual politics by Suzanne Fransway and colleagues. In sexual politics, male dominance must be continually re-won and reaffirmed. Efforts to challenge male dominance and its effects are often met with considerable antagonism. Sexual politics allows us to ask how women's inequality is produced and reproduced, both materially and discursively. In summary, we're suggesting that the persistence of violence against women be best understood in the dynamics of sexual politics. When sexual politics produces unequal gender relations or gender inequality, domestic violence is very much part of the mix. If we argue that ignorance constituted by sexual politics impacts on the incident, the consequences and the responses to violence against women. It's striking how adamant and frequent are the denials of the violence by individual male perpetrators, as well as by those more organised levels. Women's personal experiences of violence are often denied. Women and children are often discounted as liars. And the risk that male perpetrators of violence may murder their partners and their children is really, really accepted. So sexual politics perpetuates the category of not really caring to know, which has become all too common in spite of the increasing visibility of this problem. The distressing result is that women find their experiences of violence are rejected and ignored by families, friends and communities, and by the institutions and the agencies of the state. Now, an answer for the practitioners. When you have sexual politics of ignorance, do you know it's very difficult to keep agitating for well-funded, resourced crisis shelters for women and children, let alone start advocating for high investment in highly skilled staff, training and development, and a range of other interventions like long-term support and recovery. And then if you want to start advocating for the cultural and different needs of Aboriginal people or other ethnic groups or diverse groups, this contestation of sexual politics really makes me tired. We're all tired from it. To significantly reduce domestic and family violence, it impacts on women and children. It's imperative that we look beyond crisis response and stop seeing it as an incident that can be risk managed. We need to think about long-term interventions that aid healing and recovery for women and children, as well as men who use violence. What are the long-term interventions so that we can stop that violence with them? And yes, do you know what? This will require substantial state responsibility, but so be it. It's not too much to ask for, particularly in Australia, where we already have a range of services provided for women and children leaving domestic and family violence. We've got a crisis response. We know how to high risk assess. We've got accommodation supports, and we've got access to financial and material resources. Services have been developed. Interventions and programs for men have grown. But do you know what? This is hard ground won in the context of sexual politics. So again, in the context of sexual politics, state responsibility also means we can no longer deny the invisible elements that I've painted for you tonight, the long-term impacts of domestic and family violence. I'm now going to finish with you, so that we can have a panel discussion, is that if we're going to tackle the complexities of this social problem, we can no longer rely on a stretched, crisis-driven frontline workforce who is holding this issue on their own. The workforce providing these services is largely invisible, nor have they benefited from a comprehensive workforce development strategy. Despite national policy support, increased awareness raising and the development of service provision, little is actually known about who's doing this work, the nature of the workplace structures and the cultures, the work environments and the conditions across the domestic violence sector. Thus, within this climate, the question of how to best support a workforce that operates at the coalface of domestic and family violence actually demands attention. Given the important work that is done in this space, I argue that a workforce needs to be recognised and championed first, not simply a footnote to service delivery or client outcomes. This will require, though, an analysis of the complex, gendered nature of domestic and family violence work. Let me give you an example. The Royal Commission into Family Violence identified some of the challenges faced by the specialist sector, what they call the Tier 1 sector. So it's those who use the majority of their time responding to domestic and family violence. Let me paint a bleak picture for you. 80.5% are women, are female. 2% are Aboriginal. Close to a third of these tier workers are part-time, with a medium salary of only about $70,000, a bit lower for non-government. Other issues included the difficulties and resulting poor quality of industrial classification. Do you know what? A gender pay gap within the Tier 1, with men receiving higher average salary than the women, the 80% of women. 43% of the tier workers reporting that they often and always worked outside normal paid hours. The Royal Commission also noted that a lack of professional development, systematic planning and development, and low career development opportunities were particular challenges for this sector. In addition, the stressful and inherently traumatic vicarious trauma and stress posed by and experienced by this workforce is also not acknowledged. For a sector that has historically produced and advanced the theoretical rigour and evidence in explaining and understanding domestic and family violence, it's actually difficult to account for the relative lack of attention in understanding the workforce. But I raise this point not to point fingers at the already stretched female-dominated, low-paid workforce. Perhaps sexual politics can help us answer why we've got a workforce like that. Instead, I want to draw attention to the chronic undervaluing and the invisibility of this work. Despite decades of research and advocacy around this movement, a centralised gender analysis and advanced understanding of intersectionality, this all is at risk to be sidelined if we only have conversations about individual capabilities and individual training in this space. The specialist nature and skills required and the gendered nature of this problem has to be brought central and to the front in any discussions around capabilities and the family violence workforce. I'm now going to end my presentation to pose some questions about developing and supporting this workforce. In the analysis of the domestic violence workforce, Family Violence Victoria found that social work is the most commonly reported qualification across all tiers of the workforce. At Tier 1, 25% hold a social work qualification. The Royal Commission recommended the inclusion of working with families as a core topic in all curriculum and degrees. It recommended that by 2020, family violence practitioners in all funded services should have a social work or equivalent degree, this providing the impetus for the Australian Association of Social Workers to establish a credential in this field, thereby consolidating social workers as lead practitioners in domestic and family violence. They have released their family violence capability framework. Reflecting the broader social political context, the human service sector is increasingly characterised by constant demand, scarce resourcing and high pressure on the frontline workers. But despite this, research into the conditions and impacts of these types of jobs have not been prioritised. The expectations placed on this workforce are multiplying and intensifying in line with the appreciation of the complexities and the intersections of this problem. I'm concerned that the demands placed on workers have not been accompanied by a strategic focus on the nature, needs and conditions of this very workforce. If social work is going to take the professional lead in responding and working with domestic and family violence, this must happen within the context of a broader workforce strategy that also takes into consideration the significance of gender power relations, high risk, trauma environments and the emotional labour in this space. So if we are really going to have a conversation about the invisible elements of domestic and family violence, we also need a conversation that recognises the long-standing, insecure, largely invisible nature of this work that is systematically perpetuated by the competitive tendering roller coaster. There is little sense in building more and more expectations and approaches and intervention continuums if the workforce is placed last in these discussions. Just as it's disingenuousness to overlook the gender and the race regimes that shape the experiences, work and organisations with domestic and family violence. How can social work theorise domestic and family violence work that's inclusive of gender, indigeneity, and in doing so, informed strategising of the domestic family violence workforce? So let's be brave and let's start having this conversation now. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just step here for a second? Wow. Thank you very much, Sarah, for that. If your aim was to demonstrate the complexity of the issues that you're facing, you more than achieved it. And I have to say, I am humbled by your presence and your dedication to your work. Those of our panel who you're about to meet and others of you, I'm sure, who are here, who are tackling this problem. And I'm in awe of the bravery that you'll have to exhibit in the work that you do. So thank you. What I'd now like to introduce is to introduce the members of our panel. And the way that we're going to work this is that I'm going to ask some initial questions to kick off the discussion, and then I'll open it up to all of you to ask some questions. So if I could invite our panel to come up. We've got Associate Professor Lorna Hallahan from Flinders University, Jenny Cisneros, Director of Services, Women's Safety Services SA, Daniel Moss, Workforce Development Manager, Emerging Minds, and at the far end there, Fiona Ward, Deputy CEO of the Department of Child Protection. And thank you very much for joining us. I think we should first examine what we can do to enable and support the future workforce here in Australia. That very crucial point of discussion that you had at the end of your talk. And if we're going to address domestic and family violence, what is needed to tackle this complex challenge? So Jenny, if I could start with you, as a specialist who works in a domestic and family violence agency, what specialist knowledge must the workforce know, not only in specialist agencies, but across sectors if we're going to tackle this issue safely and effectively?
Thanks, Rob. I feel like I'm probably just going to say things a little less eloquently than Sarah just did. So I think for us at Women's Safety Services, approaching the work from the perspective of gender is really important to us. So having a gendered lens, understanding who it is that experiences the violence and who perpetrates it and within what context. So our workforce are thinking about what are the drivers of domestic and family violence, and what are the structural inequities in our community for women that are experiencing it. We're also really interested in coercive control, so working with women to understand, yes, what have been particular incidences of violence that they might have experienced, but also what's the pattern of coercive control and how is that interplayed for her and for her levels of risk and her levels of safety. Risk and safety, critically important to us, so understanding what that means for women. Again, that is about high risk indicators for those sort of more extreme cases, but that's also about risk for emotional safety as well. Safety planning, I suppose, is the parallel piece of work that we do alongside of that. So working with women to mitigate the risk that they're experiencing, and also working with other services to link them in so that they're also supporting safety of women and holding perpetrators accountable. And I suppose the only other thing I'd want to say to that would be a comment about the diversity of the women that we support. So that's really important to us, recognising the diversity of women who approach our service and also the diversity of their life experiences. So when we're working with women and children, we're thinking about things like culture, we're thinking about age, we're thinking about sexuality, gender identity, all of those sorts of things will inform us and support us to develop an individual response that meets the client's needs.
Thank you. Dan, you've worked with men who use violence. How can we best recognise the likely development of violent relationships and engage with both women and men safely?
Yeah, thanks. And listening to Sarah's talk, I think really kind of hit home the point that this can't just be a specialist interaction, particularly in terms of working with men. We know in mainstream services that domestic and family violence perpetration is such a large proportion of the presenting issues that that practitioners across a broad suite of services see. So we really, I think, need consistent and cohesive gender-based understandings of violence which permeate through our entire service sector, not just in the hands of the odd kind of men's behaviour change program or the odd practitioner. In my experience, I think what's been quite apparent from men that come to men's behaviour change programs or to counselling services, that they're often kind of have accessed a broad suite of causal explanations for why they've used violence. And so often the issue is not that they're not putting their hand up to say that they're doing these violent acts or perpetrating these violent acts, but that they can't make sense of why they're doing it or what to do about it. And this is particularly so where people have accessed kind of diverse theories from gender-based, but also highly psychological. They might have thought about some men's rights theories, a whole lot of individual deficit theories as well, which really kind of has them sometimes moving closer to a sense of accountability for what they're doing, but often has them feeling a sense of hopelessness that they can or that they can't change, and worse still, it can have them imbued with a sense of justification that what they do will continue to happen if their partners or children act in particular ways. So I think this really needs to be seen, I think as Sarah really put it well, as more than just a specialist kind of area. It needs to be something which is permeated throughout organisations, through constant policy and practice frameworks, through really robust supervision, and really through teaching the kind of gendered practices that we need through a whole lot of recruitment, induction and training and support processes.
Thank you. Lorna, you have a lot of experience in social work education. I wonder how you think we should be training social workers to think about these complex issues such as domestic and family violence.
Can I just start by saying how honoured I am to be working with this brilliant woman every day. There's a social work education there for me every day as you go through this, and so thank you for such a significant contribution to this discussion. Social work education is a complex creature because it's shaped by university expectations, by the professional association, by the interests and the work of those people who are charged with the teaching, and by the experiences that students bring to that exchange as well. And so we have to have a sense of how we might, at one level, satisfy a fairly functional goal, which is to make sure that social workers graduate from our programs able to carry out the sorts of functions and duties and roles that you're talking about. And that is absolutely essential. We cannot send people out into these sorts of environments empty-handed, without a strong evidence base, without a set of skills, without a set of insights to be able to do it. But I think that social work education in Australia is deeply formed in feminist traditions, and it's really important that we lay hold of that we claim it, we acknowledge its roots in all of the formation of social work. And as Sarah says, with sexual politics, we have to fight that one out on the ground again and again and again. And so it's really important that social workers in their formation and at the point at which they enter into their life as graduate social workers know that they stand on the shoulders of those women who have stepped out of those environments and been able to shape new lives for themselves and their children, alongside feminist workers who've led them in that recovery as well, and that there's a deep history here that they can draw on that is absolutely essential for understanding that wider vision of social work, which is about social transformation as well as building the resources for people to be able to live decent lives and free of fear and free of violence. And so I think that when we look at what we need to be offering social workers, one of the really crucial things for us to keep in sight here is that every little bit of the stuff that we're doing is led by our research, and that we have never stepped away from the exercise of building a profound and deep knowledge about the sorts of things that social workers have to deal with, and that has to be done by social work researchers out there, deeply embedded in the sector, working alongside social workers and their clients in the research that we do, and bringing that back not only into service development and the development of an evidence base for practice, but back into social work education. And so there is no moment when we cannot have in our sights the expectations of the university for high quality, well-delivered educational and learning opportunities, the expectations of the sector for graduates and for people who can step through a professional career, who are able to grow and commit to lifelong learning, and to be able to be the boundary riders that they need to be in order to deal with complexity and intersectionality, and also never ever to lose sight of that woman and that child, and to say that everything we do in social work education is about that person. We are client-centred from the get-go. We are student-focused, client-centred, research-informed, absolutely immersed in our sector, and absolutely committed to making sure that the social workers who step into the lives of vulnerable people are not going to make a mess of it for them.
Thank you. Fiona, continuing on with the theme of supporting our practitioners, what do you think are the any additional the key aspects of work of those who work with our Indigenous communities in terms of responding to these types of issues?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And before I answer that question, I'd probably just put a few caveats out there. One is just to acknowledge we're meeting on Kaurna land. Two, to acknowledge the cultural authority of all the Aboriginal people in the room today, and I'm not an Aboriginal person. And so three, just to say this perspective is from a non-Aboriginal perspective, not an Aboriginal perspective. So I think there are probably four critical areas for me. One is it's really important to understand that Aboriginal practice should be led by Aboriginal people, and so when we're thinking about ways of supporting Aboriginal workforce and Aboriginal professionals within the workforce, we need to really work with Aboriginal people about what that looks like and how we best deliver that support and development. But that being said, responsibilities for outcomes for safety for children and for women is also the Aboriginal children and women is also the responsibility of non-Aboriginal people. So I can talk from a child protection perspective. The majority of Aboriginal children and families are dealt with by non-Aboriginal people in our organisation. So we need to make sure we support and equip our Aboriginal staff, but equally so with our non-Aboriginal staff and how we engage with families. There's probably two big themes: recruitment and retention in that space. I can talk about what we've done or are trying to do, the journey that we're on in our department moving forward. I think the most critical one is actually recognising the expertise of Aboriginal people. And so I can talk about in the last 18 months since I've been a part of the organisation, we've created or are continuing to create